For more on the issue of Syria and its latest development, we are joined in Moscow by Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense analyst from Russia. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Tehran, Iran, we have Mr. Mohammad Marandi, associate professor at Tehran University. Welcome, professor. Meanwhile, in Boston, we are joined by Dr. Jim Walsh, director of the Security Studies Program at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome to our program, gentlemen. This is very interesting new development. Iran is being invited into the negotiations about Syria's future. So, Professor Marandi, what role can really Iran play in these negotiations? What kind of positive outcome can Iran cultivate through talks like this?
Well, I think the Iranians believe that since they, alongside the Syrians and the Iraqis, are the countries that have been fighting the extremists, alongside Russia as well, that they have a central role to play in these talks. The United States, contrary to what was said in your introduction, has not been supporting moderates. It's been supporting extremists throughout these last 5 years. In fact, the U.S. Vice President last October admitted that there are no moderates in Syria. Those are his words. So we know that the United States is funding groups that are allied to Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is the very same group that carried out 9/11 in the United States.
But Professor Marandi, I really want you to answer my question before you trade your words with your American counterparts. I really want you to, first of all, indicate very clearly what can Iran do, your country do, before we go to a spar with the other parties?
Well, I think since the Syrian government trusts the Iranians as well as the Russians, they will be willing to have in-depth talks with their partners in the struggle against extremism, and therefore, and also the position that is opposed to that of Saudi Arabia and Turkey is strengthened at the negotiating table. Obviously, the Syrian government is not going to accept any agreement at a negotiating table where the Turks and the Saudis are involved, because the Turks and the Saudis have been supporting both ISIL in the past. The Turks continue to do so, and the Saudis are supporting Al-Qaeda as well as other groups today. So when the Iranians and the Russians are at the negotiating table, I think the Syrians feel more confident that their side is more fairly represented.
I see. Dr. Walsh, from the U.S. perspective, of course, earlier we have heard already from Professor Marandi pinpointing the United States supporting extremists, as he said, from the Iranian side inside Syria. But what about from the American perspective? What can you, the United States, can the United States constructively work with countries like Iran in these negotiations? Not just by simply inviting, but also really do something. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I supported including Iran in these negotiations. That's been my position for some time now. I think, despite what my good friend Professor Marandi has said, he wants to pick and choose who gets to sit at the table. I think all the parties that are involved directly or indirectly and have a stake in this outcome have to be part of the dialogue. If Iran is not part of the dialogue, if the Syrian opposition is not part of the dialogue, then you're not going to get a political settlement that's going to be sustainable. So I welcome Iran's and Russia's participation in this. I think from the U.S. perspective, the hope is that Russia and U.S. combined, the two big great powers, will be able to host this dialogue and encourage the parties to try to find some solution. Now, I am skeptical. I support a political dialogue. I think that's the only way this is going to get resolved. But I come into this with some skepticism. It seems to me the positions of all the parties are almost the opposite. Assad is saying he he will not resign under any circumstances, and the other side says he has to go first before we make progress. There's not a lot of room there. The Iranians have a new proposal that they adopted today, but I remain skeptical as to whether the people who are doing the fighting are willing to stop. Now, all the outsiders, the U.S., Russia, Turkey, others, may want an end to this conflict, but will the people with the guns stop fighting? That I remain to be convinced about.
Mr. Falkenhauer, does the fact that Iran now is already being jointly invited by the United States and Russia to the negotiation, and also Mr. Assad still in power inside Syria, a victory for Russia?
Well, it's far from victory. And of course, inviting Iran to this dialogue, that's very reasonable because Iran is very much involved in Syria and actually also in Iraq in opposing ISIS. And so they're an important player. You can't find a solution without them. But of course, even with them, finding a solution will not be easy. And this week, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was actually quoted the Russian President Vladimir Putin that in the Russian opinion, first there should be victory over the extremists, and only after that there can be political reconciliation in Syria. And that's a very kind of tough position because you first have to have victory, and victory does not seem that assured. The Russians are bombing. The Russian pilots, some of them are flying up to 4 bombing sorties a day. But the fight is continuing, and despite the Russian official kind of very triumphant communiques, the opposition is still fighting. It's far from any kind of victory, military or political.
I think there are several things, several layers of things that's happening all at the same time. What is happening on the ground, the realities is inside Syria, and how the world powers and regional powers can work together or against one another in terms of seeking a political solution to the Syria's crisis. And of course, the question about the Assad government vis-a-vis the different kinds of political forces inside Syria, that's another layer of question. So let's focus with the three of you here on the specific regional and world powers. We don't get our excuses not to talk about our own job. So, Professor Morandi, let me ask you this. There has been earlier reports suggesting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard coming from Iran, some of the top officials have been spotted inside Syria. That was about 2 weeks ago, according to AP, the Associated Press report. Of course, Iran denied it, but exactly what do you think is the level of involvement of Iran and the way you will be able to sway the directions of things happening on the ground inside Syria, in fact, is happening right now, Professor?
Well, Iran hasn't denied its involvement at all. In fact, the Iranians have been very explicit that they have increased the numbers of advisors and experts in the field, and they've also said that since the fighting is going to be more intense during this period where the Russian Air Force has joined the Syrian Air Force, that the increased number of Iranian experts and advisors will be in the front line. So the Iranians were expecting deaths in battle. And they feel that in Tehran there is no option because if the extremists get the upper hand, if the Al-Qaeda forces that the United States and its allies are cooperating with it directly or indirectly, or ISIL get the upper hand, it would be a catastrophic for not just Syria but for the whole region. Indeed, over the past few days, ISIL and the Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, have launched a joint assault in the south of Aleppo to block government and army supply lines. And it's interesting that the United States over the past 4 days, while ISIL was preparing itself for this attack, had stopped bombing ISIL, even though the U.S.
So
has
what
never
are you
really
trying
hit
to
them
suggest
very hard
here,
over the
Professor
past
Morandi?
year.
If you
But
want
they've
to
stopped
suggest something,
bombing
just
them
go directly.
over the past 4 days.
Are you saying the United States is helping IS? Is that what you're trying to suggest?
Well, the point is that the Americans, yes, the United States is helping groups allied to Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda right now, as we speak, are fighting in coordination with ISIL in the south of the city of Aleppo, or what is also called Halab. That is something that we see, and we see the American airstrikes have stopped.
All right.
So
may I also follow up with your accusation? That is, what is Iran's role really in the negotiations? Is Iran's role, as the Americans would say, forever accusing Americans of things that they are doing or they have not been doing, and therefore that is the role of the Iran in the negotiation? What exactly is the role of Iran? Sir, you have to tell me.
Right, as I pointed out, the Iranians have a very explicit role to play in Syria. The Iranians have had advisors in Syria for a very long period of time, and they've increased those numbers. And if need be, the Iranians will increase them further. The Iranians have also sent drones to Syria, and if need be, the Iranians will also send their air force, I believe. So I don't think that the Iranians are hiding anything. The Iranians are very explicit that ISIL and Al-Qaeda must be defeated.
I see.
They are a threat to global security. They're a threat to Chinese security, to Russian security, and to European security.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor. Your point, Mr. Falkenhauer, it seems that the rounds, as you said, of air bombing from Russia into Syria toward those extremist corners have really not worked so far. Do you think that degree has to be increased? What can be the role of the Russian military in that regard? Can you work, let's just say, with the Western countries, also Iran and some of the others in the region, in that specific military strikes in the future?
Well, basically that was the Russian strategy to begin with, and that's what our President Vladimir Putin was saying, to form a wide coalition against the ISIS and other extremists in Syria and also in Iraq, and we should all kind of work together, and we were ready to work with the Americans. I mean,
how ready? To what extent can you do that? And what conditions,
should agree
though?
to work with Assad. That's also part of the thing.
Very interesting.
Yes, they should agree to work with Assad, and that's kind of also part of it, and that's what the United States is, of course, not ready to do. And regional Sunni powers, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, also don't want actually to have much to do with the Assad forces, which we argue are the most well-organized forces fighting the extremists. Right now it's some of an impasse there, and increasing military action is not really that easy to do.
Dr. Walsh, why can't the United States work with Assad, at least for some periods and some time in the near future? Obviously, the other two gentlemen have pointed out very clearly, this is one of the most important political solutions you could have at this moment. So what does Washington have in mind? Want to refusing the easier solution and look for some other solutions which will not be working, as they have already said very clearly? Dr. Walsh.
Well, I'm impressed by the relative amnesia of my Iranian friend, less so my Russian friend, who I think is pretty clear-eyed on this. You know, we forget that Assad is a war criminal. He used chemical weapons against the civilian population. We have the government of Iran, who was a victim of chemical warfare by Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, defending a dictator who, first of all, wiped out the nonviolent opposition. Why are there only extremists left? Because Assad murdered all the nonviolent people and left this vacuum for extremists.
Okay, here we go.
And,
okay,
uses,
Dr. Walsh,
barrel bombs, fuel barrel bombs.
You could be talking ideologically.
May I respond?
Yeah, please. Let me just ask him, and then you respond as well. So you could talk ideologically. You could talk idealistically also. But let's take a look at the reality that many of your partners, including the two other gentlemen, have already suggested very clearly that political solution has one of the most important conditions, that is to work with Assad. That seems to be a constructive way forward at this moment against terrorism. What do you say? And then I'll let Professor
I just
Morandi
don't buy it. Yeah, I just don't buy it. First of all, again, as I said at the beginning, it's one thing to get an agreement in Geneva. It's another to get the parties on the ground to stop fighting. I think Assad is a war criminal, and frankly, I don't think Russia or Iran is particularly tied to Assad. They're tied to Syria, and I totally understand that. It's in their national interest. Russia has bases there. It's their only ally in the region. There are other reasons why Iran, it's in their national interest to support Syria. I totally get that.
All right.
But, yeah, and even the Iranians in this proposal this morning said they see a process where Assad leaves in 6 months. So I don't think supporting Assad is what this is about. It's about trying to come up with a political solution in which Assad leaves, there's power sharing, but I just think that's going to be enormously difficult. I don't see Daesh stopping fighting regardless of what happens in Geneva. I don't see the other parties doing it either. I wish that were true, but I don't see it.
Professor Morandi, your time to respond to that. Professor Morandi.
Well, first of all, Iran has not agreed to President Assad stepping down in 6 months. That is a rumor that I think Reuters has spread, and which is completely false. In addition to that, I think the U.S. support for the Saudi assault on Yemen and the slaughter of tens of thousands of people there shows that the Americans are not worried about war criminals. Or when the United States gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, they were not worried about war criminals. In Syria, there is no evidence that the Assad government carried out those attacks, and it is an issue which is being debated today. The Iranians actually believe that it was the extremists that carried out those chemical attacks, and I think that Jim knows the argument, so I don't want to go there. What the Iranians said from early on was that the Annan plan, despite the fact that Kofi Annan was close to the United States, the Iranians accepted the Annan plan, where there would be free and fair elections with international monitors. This was 4 years ago, but the United States and its allies, instead of accepting the Annan plan, which was reasonable, they thought they could steamroll into Damascus. They failed, and if anyone is responsible for slaughter and death in that country, it is those countries that have created this civil war, and the President of the United States as well as the Turkish president.
We see so much debates already about finger pointing.
During this process,
there's a lot of finger pointing already. Let me ask Mr. Felgenhauer for the last question before we go to both of you for the final words. Mr. Felgenhauer, it's really fair that I let you speak. Russia cannot be silent in this discussion. So let me ask you, sir, obviously we've already seen two camps. So with the joining of Iran, are we seeing those two camps of very opposite opinions being in a way strengthened up, and therefore no solution, it seems, would be in sight, even less opportunity than before? Your comments.
I believe that is the fact. I don't expect no real breakthroughs from these Vienna talks. The positions of the different parties are hardly reconcilable easily, and of course the opposition and actually the Assad regime are not represented. So it's a kind of peace conference through proxy, and the conflict in Syria clearly is developing into a kind of proxy war, not like maybe absolutely like those that happened during the Cold War, but still very much moving in that very dangerous direction, which would mean more fighting, more suffering, and the end result, no matter who wins, like in Afghanistan, where there was a similar proxy war in the 80s, would be maybe an outcome that no one's going to like.
Well, I don't want to be cynical here, but I really want to read to you briefly the Secretary General of the United Nations talking about flexibility, gentlemen. These countries, you should have flexibility when doing and discussing about Iran issues, and also get rid of your national perspective. This is what the UN Secretary General said, and in favor of quote-unquote global leadership. In that spirit, the other two gentlemen, may I have your final words about what is really ahead in the near future? What can your country do? One sentence if you can, sir. Professor Morandi.
Well, I think there's no way that anyone can reasonably accept flexibility when it comes to ISIL and Al-Qaeda.
Okay.
The Wahhabi ideology is spread by Saudi Arabia. It's a U.S. ally, and the United States is allowing the same groups that carried out 9/11 to work and thrive in Syria, and ultimately they will see the blowback.
That's another accusation. Dr. Walsh, you want to respond with another accusation or a solution?
No, I mean, I don't think that's really what I've done here. I agree with my Russian colleague. I
One
think
sentence
his
you can,
diagnosis is exactly right. I agree with my Russian colleague. I think he's right. I prefer flexibility over propagandistic talking points. That's what's going to solve this. But again, it depends on what the fighters on the ground want to do, and I think it's going to be tough, very tough.
It's going to be tough. It's going to be very complicated, already reflected in our conversation today, even on the Friday. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for coming over to our program. Really appreciate your insights and your frank attitudes. Thank you, Jim Walsh in the United States, Mohammed Morandi in Iran, and Pavel Felgenhauer in Russia. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.